At the moment that this video is being prepared, watchers of the Russia-Ukraine conflicts are in shock. On the weekend of September the 10th to the 11th, Ukraine's forces smashed through Russian lines in the Kharkiv region. But rather than gain a handful of villages or a strategic point, they kept right on rolling, across towns, across hamlets, through cities. By the time this breakthrough force came to a halt, the entire Russian line had collapsed. An area larger than Delaware had been liberated in what has been called the worst Russian defeat since 1943. Now, since our production process takes time, we'll refrain from giving you our hot take. By the time you watch this, the dust will have already settled. Rather, we want to use this video to highlight one key tactic the Ukrainians used. A tactic borrowed from an American victory, nearly as audacious as the liberation of Kharkiv Oblast, the Thunder Run. First used to stunning effect in the 2003 invasion of Iraq, Thunder Runs are both high risk and capable of generating insanely high rewards. Today, we're analyzing the history of this powerful tactic and how it may affect the future of the Ukraine war. When news of Ukraine's breakthrough began to spread on social media, many journalists turned to a famous Hemingway quote to describe how the tide of war turned. Slowly, and then all at once. Originally used to describe the process of bankruptcy, the quote today is almost a cliche, yet watching real-time maps update to show the steady spread of Ukraine's gains after months of stalemate, it was impossible to feel that this time, well, the cliche was more than apt. Russia's defenses in Kharkiv Oblast had gone from slow erosion to utter collapse in just a matter of days. On September the 8th, 2022, the day Ukraine broke through, the front lines had seemed almost static. Russia controlled the east and north of the oblast, sitting within easy firing range of Kharkiv city itself. In fact, the line of conflict was so settled that news of Ukraine's advance was initially treated as a welcome but extremely localized victory. Some voices even suggested that they should turn back before they got surrounded. But that, as you already know, is not what happened. Instead, Kiev's counteroffensive just kept right on rolling. By September the 10th, Ukrainian forces had punched 80 kilometers beyond the Russian lines, clear through the vital city of Izium. By September the 12th, they'd gotten to the Russian border and then come right up to Luhansk Oblast. At the time of writing this video, they'd gone on to recapture a toehold there too. No mean feat in a region completely surrounded by Russia since the summer. When the forward thrust at last slowed, the amount of territory retaken had grown to eye-watering size. Around Kharkiv alone, more than 8,000 square kilometers were liberated, equivalent to over 3,000 square miles, an area nearly 3 times the size of Rhode Island. As for the Russians, well, to call their performance disastrous would be to do a disservice to, well, disasters. The implosion of the Russian lines was a rout, a moment in battle when all discipline breaks down, panic sets in, and everyone's sole focus is just trying to escape the onslaught. Hundreds of battle tanks were abandoned. Entire ammunition stores were just left for Ukrainians to claim. Infantry vehicles, armored personnel carriers, and piles of equipment were all just left in place. Meanwhile, reports swarmed in of Russian soldiers changing in civilian clothes and running for the border. Scores upon scores of them were captured. By most reckonings, this was the biggest Russian military defeat since 1943. Eerily, that disaster also took place in the same area, around Izium. So, how did plucky underdog Ukraine pull off something no one had done in nearly 80 years? How did they manage to bloody the nose of the Russian bear so badly? Well, part of it was misdirection and good logistics. While Russia was focused on the southern front in Kherson, Kiev managed to move about 4 brigades of nearly 10,000 troops into the Kharkiv area. And our part always good integrated command. Unlike the Russians, Ukraine managed to get all of its artillery, aviation, air defense, and infantry working in harmony, exerting unstoppable pressure. But a third, overlooked part was the use of Thunder Runs. A form of reconnaissance by fire. The textbook Thunder Run involves getting in a highly armored, extremely fast-moving vehicle and then charging hell for leather into enemy areas. At its least spectacular, this should have two major effects. One, that you could test the enemy's strength before you retreat, figuring out what he's got on where, and two, you can use that to cause some chaos and shake up a stalemate, the equivalent of casually tossing a live grenade into a chessboard. At its best, though, a Thunder Run can take you further. Way further. In Iraq in 2003, it was the Thunder Run to Saddam's palace that precipitated Baghdad's fall as the psychological impact of US forces pushing to the heart of the capital completely demoralized the city's defenders. It was the sort of impact the Ukrainians were seeking to recreate. But even they couldn't have realized how successful they were going to be. While the Americans in the Iraq War had used armored infantry carriers known as Bradleys backed by tanks, the Ukrainians had used civilian 4x4s as their spearhead. The advantage of that was when the Russian lines broke, Ukraine's Toyotas could absolutely bomb it along the roads, advancing at breakneck speed. Whenever they encountered an enemy formation, anti-tank teams would immediately dismount and engage before leaping back in and zooming on, leaving the armor and Ukrainian tanks following in their wake, just to mop up. There are even reports that they deliberately avoided settlements, preferring to penetrate deeper and cause more chaos before doubling back later. It was this pressure that shattered the Russians' morale. Not just the initial lightning-fast assault, but also the confusion and panic it sowed. To quote, "Ukrainians ahead of me, Ukrainians behind me, and here I am about to die in the middle." Unsurprisingly, most chose to simply run. Clearly then, Thunder Runs were the best tactic to use at this time, and the Ukrainians used them brilliantly. But they are far from a Ukrainian invention. To fully understand where this sudden counterattack came from, we need to go back a few years to a vastly alien time. A time when the US was desperately looking for new methods of warfare. A time when Ukraine had only just voted to leave the Russian-dominated union known as the USSR. Modern history of Thunder Runs begins not with victorious Ukrainian units sweeping across the Kharkiv countryside, but with one of America's most stinging peacetime defeats. In October of 1993, an attempt to capture targets from the dense urban environment of Mogadishu, Somalia, spiraled into catastrophe when two Black Hawk helicopters were shot down. Surrounded by hostile forces, the survivors of the crashes were forced to jerry-rig defensive areas and fight for their lives. While many were ultimately saved by an extraction team, the rescue effort itself generated more bloodshed. Popularly known as Black Hawk Down, after the book and movie of the same name, it was America's bloodiest battle since Vietnam. 18 US troops were killed, 73 were injured. Some of the bodies left behind were desecrated by local militia. It was also a gargantuan PR disaster. The public backlash to the botched mission was so angry, so indignant, that it upended military thinking. In the White House, the Clinton administration would spend the next few years terrified of committing troops overseas. But the impact would arguably be greater in the army. Faced with the country in uproar over less than 24 deaths, military planners were forced to face a fact that they'd been dimly aware of for some time. Current practice for urban operations was in desperate need of change. As the battle in Mogadishu had shown, fighting in urban environments is always tricky, is always bloody. While Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union had both happily fed men into the meat grinder of urban combat, it was now painfully clear that a democracy could never accept so many casualties. That street-by-street fighting in a future conflict would just be politically impossible. No, something new was needed, a way to avoid getting bogged down in urban fighting, a way to avoid large death tolls. It was from these worries that the modern Thunder Run would be born. Although they're credited to American forces fighting in Iraq, various forms of Thunder Runs have been around for decades. The origin of the term actually dates to Vietnam, where they denoted something very different. Faced with the Viet Cong that was laying prodigious amounts of landmines across roads, US forces came up with a simple way to clear them. Since standard minesweeping operations took hours, creating traffic jams of men and equipment that could be ambushed, the Americans instead chose to just trigger the devices using M48 pattern tanks. In these early Thunder Runs, two tanks drove side by side at high speed along roads suspected of being mined. Sturdy enough to absorb blasts and just keep on rolling, they could quickly clear an area, allowing less densely armored vehicles to zip on through. While this is mostly unlike the tactic we're discussing today, aside from the name, it did have two aspects that would survive into modern Thunder Runs: speed and aggression. Speed because the tanks would go hell for leather trying to trigger everything, and aggression because they would light up all guns at once as they did so, trying to draw out any possible ambush. Now, compare this to the tactics of the modern Thunder Run. Armor up, driving fast, all guns blazing, and test the enemy's weak spots before getting out again without engaging. You can kinda see the basic similarities, right? Of course, high-speed reconnaissance by fire has been used in many wars, but what would set the Thunder Runs apart was their emphasis on good logistics and managed risk. After all, everyone in the mid-1990s had already witnessed an extremely good example of a high-speed assault gone wrong. The date was New Year's Eve, 1994. The place was Grozny. The context? The First Chechen War. Prior to the attack, the Russian army had assured Moscow it could subdue the Chechen capital within hours. Their plan? A lightning run into the city center, where the overwhelming display of might would cause the defenders' morale to crumble. Instead, it led to one of the biggest Russian military disasters this side of Ukraine. By January 2nd, 1995, Russia's 331st Separate Motor Rifle Brigade that led the attack had been effectively wiped out. 80% of its troops were killed or captured. 20 main battle tanks were destroyed. All but 18 of its 120 armored vehicles went up in smoke. A remaking of urban combat, the assault on Grozny was not. Rather, it was a humiliation, and an extremely costly one at that. The American military planners who monitored the disaster didn't merely gloat. They took the lessons on board. They tried to understand where the Russians went wrong. As a result, by the time 2003 rolled around, they'd be more than ready. If Grozny was a textbook example of a fast assault gone wrong, the real-life equivalent of Jojo Rabbit blowing himself up with a grenade while the instructor tells the students, "Don't do that," then the April 2003 run into Baghdad is probably about as close to the platonic ideal as a Thunder Run can get. In a lightning-paced attack, 975 soldiers of the US 3rd Infantry Division would blast through from the outskirts to the very heart of Baghdad, a heavily defended city with a population of over 5 million. Utilizing just 44 Bradleys and 88 Abrams tanks, they would capture Saddam's palace, 3 key interchanges, and a road to the airport for resupply, and they'd do it all in just 3 days. To be clear, this was an insane endeavor. Had you walked into the Pentagon and outlined this plan prior to 2003, you'd have been given a box of crayons and sent back to elementary school to restart your military education from the beginning. And coalition forces recognized this. The initial plan was to place Baghdad under siege while infantry and airborne troops took out those defending the capital. Urban Combat 101. But perhaps mindful of the casualties, this plan was changed at the last minute. In doing so, military history was made. Not that many knew that this was happening at the time. On April 4th, 2003, commander of the 2nd Brigade of the 3rd Infantry Division, mechanized, Colonel David Perkins, called in Army Lieutenant Colonel Eric Schwartz and told him to prepare to attack Baghdad. Perkins' idea was to conduct a basic Thunder Run. Rather than conquer the city, Schwartz was to lead a high-speed, heavily armored team along 17 kilometers of Baghdad roads right into the center, drawing out what the Iraqis had and testing for any weak spots. That done, they'd head pell-mell for the American-held airport, leaving panic and chaos in their wake. That chaos was a key selling point. As Perkins later explained, he wanted to, quote, "create as much confusion as I can inside the city because I had found that my soldiers or my units can react to chaos much better than the enemy can." It was a plan that called for sustained momentum, for any damaged vehicles to be abandoned, their crews immediately evacuated on those still rolling. It was also a plan that was going to work even better than anticipated. On April 5th, Rogue Battalion, officially Task Force 164, entered Baghdad on Highway 8 just after dawn. With just 30 tanks and 14 Bradleys, they plowed through the waking city, punching vast holes in its defenses. Under constant fire, they swept in and they swept out, guns blazing, at last screeching onto the tarmac at the airport after a couple of hours of intense fighting. In that time, they'd lost 1 tank, 1 commander, and suffered some minor injuries. Iraqi casualties, by contrast, were estimated at 1,000. And all of this explains the decision of Major General Buford C. Blount III. Stood on the blazing hot airport tarmac with Colonel Perkins immediately following the success, Blount told his subordinate to do it all over again just 2 days later. As last time, the plan was for a quick in-and-out Thunder Run, one that would go in heavier, lead to even more Iraqi casualties, and so even more confusion, softening the city up for the siege. In the end, though, the second run would go so well that there would be no need for a siege at all. The biggest factor was Colonel Perkins' decision to blast through to the palace and stay there, establishing a defensible perimeter. It was intended as a propaganda stunt. At this time, the Iraqi information minister Mohammed Saeed al-Sahaf was constantly on TV, telling Iraqis that the Americans were dying by the thousands. Perkins reasoned that snatching ground in the center of Baghdad would show even the most die-hard Saddam supporters that Iraq was destined to lose. The convoy set off along the same highway on April the 7th. This time, they went in blasting heavier than ever. Everything hostile along that highway got hammered with bullets, with follow-up armor destroying anything that survived. A second unit behind recovered any Americans from disabled vehicles. Perkins had been explicit in his instructions. The leading task force should stop for nothing. Baghdad never knew what hit it. Within 2 hours, the lead battalion had occupied Saddam's palace and was giving interviews to an embedded news crew. Those 3 key junctions, nicknamed Larry, Curly, and Moe, had been seized. Interestingly, it's amid this victory that we can catch a glimpse of how a Thunder Run could go badly wrong by failing to secure supply lines. With fuel running low at the junctions without a resupply route secured, drivers had to race 2,500-gallon fuel trucks through Iraqi-held areas. This nearly ended the entire operation when one of them was hit by a rocket-propelled grenade and went up like a gigantic bomb. At another of the vital junctions, miscommunication meant the resupply trucks thought they weren't needed there. Moments like this are why people were initially wary about celebrating Ukraine's recent breakthrough. No matter how far and how forcefully you push into enemy territory, it's all for nothing if they can just turn around, cut your supply lines, and then surround you at their leisure. Just as with Ukraine's 2022 assault, though, the Iraq Thunder Run ultimately succeeded. By evening, the palace, junctions, and resupply road to the airport were all under American control. For all its thousands of defenders, the city now had a hostile force sat at its very center. Within 2 days, the regime had collapsed. While what came next would be nothing to celebrate, the assault on Baghdad had been a jaw-dropping success. As Colonel Perkins said in a post-battle assessment, "We had come in, created a lot of chaos, lots of violence and momentum all at once. We had speed and audacity. And now with a resupply, we were there for good, and there was nothing the other side could do about it." It was this punching through and sowing of chaos that Ukraine sought to recreate in Kharkiv Oblast. In many ways, they did so better than even Colonel Perkins could have dreamed about, scoring a surprise victory up there with the capture of Baghdad. But now, for the tricky part, trying to figure out whether this is a one-off or something Ukraine could do again. To figure out if Ukraine can repeat their stunning success around Kharkiv, we have to understand what made it work in the first place. We covered some of this in the opening. Excellent misdirection, good logistics and integrated commands, and of course, amazing bravery by the Ukrainian troops. But it's worth looking to why Russia's lines collapsed so dramatically, more dramatically than even Kiev expected. Because if we dig a little, it starts to seem as if the circumstances in the northeast were possibly a one-off, a perfect storm of Russian incompetence, hubris, and poor command. First of all, the hubris. At the time of their breakthrough, Ukraine had spent months convincing Moscow the big battle would be fought down in Kherson, some 500 kilometers to the south. Russia had taken the bait, sending most of its best units and heavy armor to defend the occupied port city. Crucially, though, Putin also seems to have assumed that even the weakest units around Kharkiv could hold off any Ukrainian counterattacks. By September the 8th, the Russian lines in the oblast were stretched impossibly thin, and while some elite troops and main army battalions were on hand, other holes had been plugged with low-grade recruits from the self-declared People's Republic of Luhansk and Donetsk. On top of that, Moscow failed to heed the warning signs. About a week before the counterattack began, Russian mill bloggers, Telegram channel hosts with ties to the army, were sounding the alarm about a buildup of Ukrainian forces. In response, Russia just shrugged. And that takes us nicely to their second failure: incompetence. Not only were Russia's lines spread thin, they also had no depth. That means that once the Ukrainians punched through, they could just keep right on rolling. In a situation like this, you ideally want to have reinforcements close enough to the fronts that they can go roaring towards any breaches in an emergency. In fact, ideally, you don't want to be in this situation at all. Once it became apparent just how stretched their forces were, Russia should have decided what gains really mattered and concentrated their remaining power on holding strategically important areas, even if that meant falling back from some previously held grounds. But no, in both cases, the military failed to do something so basic even YouTubers like us can call them out on it. Hyper-advanced military strategy this was not. And finally, we come to the greatest weakness of all: poor command. Throughout this war, it's been clear that various parts of Russia's once vaunted military are barely even capable of communicating with one another. At the exact moment units were needed in the north to shore up the Kharkiv lines, swaths of troops were being unnecessarily committed to the separate Russian effort near Donetsk. As the Institute for Study of War incredulously noted, the Russians cannot hope to make gains around Bakhmut or Donetsk city on a large enough scale to derail Ukrainian counteroffensives and appear to be continuing an almost robotic effort to gain ground in Donetsk Oblast that seems increasingly divorced from the overall realities of the theater. In other words, the invasion force was behaving less like a cohesive whole and more like three entirely separate, even rival armies that just happened to invade Ukraine all at the same time and had no interest in helping one another. On their own, any of these things could have caused Russia's lines to crumble. Taken together, they led to the almighty collapse that Ukraine took full advantage of. The question now is, can this be repeated elsewhere? Well, it's tough to say. There's no doubt that Russia's entire military apparatus is plagued by these problems, along with an additional one of rock-bottom morale. However, it's also unclear if one of the other fronts is as ripe for exploitation as Kharkiv was. Down in Kherson, Russian lines are both well-staffed, robust, and extremely dug in. Over in the Donbass, massed artillery is still allowing Putin's men to slowly crawl forward, eating away at Ukraine. The element of surprise that was likewise so key to the Kharkiv offensive is now also gone. You can bet that any mill blogger chatter about a Ukrainian troop build-up will be given close attention from now on. Still, there are areas of weakness. Some of the defenses around Luhansk Oblast near Kharkiv, for example, may just be ready to give. They just need the push of another set of thunder runs, followed by ground advance to break through. While it's doubtful, barring a total collapse of Russian morale, that we'll see another spectacular advance like in Kharkiv, it may be that Ukraine has plenty more chances to break through. And when they finally do, it could be that we'll look on that crazy weekend of September the 10th to the 11th, 2022, and realize that this was the moment when Ukraine finally started winning the war.